because the evidence that was used to lock up the three main suspects was very shaky. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about that in this episode. But first, I want to talk about Catherine Keller. So she was the 25-year-old girlfriend of Fred, sometimes called Herbert Smith. Herbert was his alias. So you'll see that if you look around in different newspaper accounts. But Fred Smith, he was found guilty of murder along with David Blackstone and Frank Oliver, and they were sent to prison the night that they were convicted. They pleaded guilty. They supposedly all confessed. Now, Catherine Keller was also arrested, and she was being charged as an accessory after the fact of the quadruple torch murders. So leniency was recommended for Keller, who testified for 9 straight hours. Here's what the Times Herald of Port Huron had to say. This is from October 16th, 1931. The evidence against her was almost entirely circumstantial. The prosecution seeking to prove that she was associated with Smith before and after the murders of Harry Lohr, Thomas Wheatley, Vivian Gold, and Anna Mae Harrison. Interference throughout was that Miss Keller was intimate with Smith, Frank Oliver, and David Blackstone, Negro, the convicted slayers, and knew they committed the crime. Fred Smith's mother had the most damaging testimony against Miss Keller. She testified that the defendant asked her to say Fred was at home the night the four teens were robbed and slain and their bodies burned in an automobile. End quote. This is an interesting point about Fred Smith's mother testifying. And the reason is because his mother also testifies that she did not approve of Catherine Keller allowing her son to hang around at her house. The mom did not want Fred at her house because he liked to hang out in the part of town where African Americans lived. So Fred's mother obviously had some problems with race, and she didn't think that was appropriate, so he could not live with her if he was doing that. So he was dating Catherine Keller, and she didn't have a problem with it, so he was staying at her house. So this is a very interesting point, because why would you talk to your boyfriend's mother, who you've obviously had some rifts with about who he associates with? Why would you tell her her son's alibi? Why would you do that? Your boyfriend, he has an alibi, or he's trying to create an alibi, and you would get his mom on board with it, even though you guys don't get along. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. But let's go back and talk about how Catherine got on trial in the first place. So part of the reason that Catherine Keller ends up on trial is because, honestly, based on the confessions, they don't line up. Like I said, all of a sudden, after the confessions, there started to be supposedly, allegedly, all this information that pointed to David Blackstone and Fred Smith and Frank Oliver being the killers, but it really wasn't lining up. So that seems to be part of the reason why they keep Catherine Keller in custody. They're grilling her. They want to know what she knows. If they also end up going up to Marquette, to the state prison, and they grill Blackstone, Smith, and Oliver, because they say, oh, they're probably responsible for tons of murders. So this is a very interesting way that she gets to trial. She gets on trial because Judge George Sample of Washtenaw County, he sat as a one-man grand jury and decided what responsibility Catherine Keller had in the torch murders. So he alone decides that she needs to go to trial. There's enough evidence for her to go and things like that. So you've got one guy. I don't know why it was a one-man grand jury. I'm not clear on that. They don't explain it, but it seems a little odd. Also, Catherine Keller, she really gets taken through the ringer for dating Fred Smith. So her uncle, Judge Darwin Z. Curtis, passed away in February of 1931. So he dies in February. The torch murders take place in August. So that's, you know, what, 6 months before the torch murders. But due to her association with Fred Smith, there is speculation that she may have poisoned her uncle. Um, and he left her $35,000. She was his heir. He had taken her into his home when she was a baby and raised her. So that was his heir. She got $35,000 and, everything that he owned. So once they get the confessions of the torch murderers and they find out that Catherine Keller is dating Fred Smith, they decide, well, maybe she poisoned her uncle. Now, her uncle's death does not appear to have any suspicion surrounding it when he dies. He was 70 years old, and in 1931, that's pretty good. He was at a hospital when he died. He also suffered a serious illness a few days before he passed away, but his health had been failing for years. That's why it's so strange that his body was exhumed after the torch murders. They exhumed the body and wanted to find out if he had been poisoned, but there was none of this suspicion when he died. And this takes me back to the fact that Wayne County is prosecuting this case. And as we talked about in the previous episode, we have Harry Bennett, the forged strongman, involved in the case. And we also have the Wayne County prosecutor at this time. He is someone who has helped bring down the murder rate of Detroit. So in 1929, Detroit has the highest murder rate in the country. So just to show you, the more things change, the more they stay the same, because that would also be true again when I was growing up in Detroit. But they had the highest murder rate, and they elected this guy, Harry S. Toy, and he has a no-nonsense approach to crime. So basically, he comes in, he cleans things up, he gets the murder rate. Detroit ends up moving down to 37th overall in the country. So people really like him. He is aggressive on crime, which is a great thing. He closes the cases fast. He makes sure to prosecute and get the people into prison. The only problem with that is sometimes some of the people may not be guilty. So this is a problem. Eventually, after they, exhume Catherine's uncle's body and everything, and they find out, oh, he wasn't poisoned, she still goes to trial, and she ends up getting sentenced to 4 to 5 years at the Detroit House of Corrections. Now, in her appeal, it was alleged that the conviction was not valid because she had not been granted a change of venue. So there was all the stigma surrounding her in Ypsilanti, and she requested a change of venue. They denied it. And the Assistant Attorney General questioned Catherine in regards to testimony related to fortune telling. Now, I wasn't quite able to find what that was about, but so we've got a vision from a guy that ends up, inspiring police to arrest the people who get these 4 life sentences. And now we've got something about fortune telling. I don't even know what that's about. But also, Fred Smith was not allowed to appear in court. So a new trial was granted in 1933, and I have not been able to find definitive information on whether or not Catherine actually served time in prison for the torch murders, or if she was acquitted. Another curious clue that happens after the fact, because if you remember, the killers they supposedly confessed and were convicted in a matter of hours and sent to prison. Well, part of the confession from Fred Smith was proven to be false. So once again, we have Wayne County. They are working the case from a certain angle. Like they worked the case from a certain angle, and they're actually the ones who end up with the suspects. And, that's how we get prosecution here. Now, Catherine Keller, she's tried in Washtenaw County, but these confessions, they don't line up. So Deputy Squires, who is in Washtenaw County, he's trying to trace down how these confessions fit the crime. One thing that is rather interesting is that Fred Smith says that he threw the gun into a body of water because the gun jammed when he tried to shoot the other teenagers, and that's why only Harry Lore was shot. Well, even though there are newspaper articles that say the gun was recovered and it was determined to be Fred Smith's, the gun was supposedly recovered from a backyard where Blackstone had been. And he said it was Fred Smith's. And then Fred Smith was talking about he had to get out of town. Like all this craziness that does not line up with what's happening. So Deputy Squires in Washtenaw County, he's trying to trace down this gun and he can't find it. But if they had a gun and the ballistics matched, then why would the gun be in the water? But like I said, the confessions, they just don't line up with the crime. But Squires also, he's like going through the confessions and he's trying to find how this lines up. Also, Fred Smith claims that he ditched his shirt somewhere in Detroit, and it just isn't true. They do find a shirt, but the shirt had been out in the elements for much longer than, a few weeks. So that didn't line up either. Once again, I think that this is why Wayne County took over the Torch murders, like why they are the ones who present the suspects, because they had the prosecutor who was known to, get people in jail for crimes. So this case is a massive rabbit hole. So we'll hit one more point. So David Blackstone died in prison on August 11th or 12th in 1950. If he died on August 11th, that would make it exactly 19 years to the day that Harry Lore, Vivian Goad, Anna Mae Harrison, and Thomas Wheatley died. The documents from the Ypsilanti Historical Society say that David Blackstone died in a stone crusher. They say it was poetic justice. But the Detroit Free Press reported that Blackstone died in a prison hospital of a cerebral hemorrhage. Another newspaper says he was found dead in his cell after a cerebral hemorrhage. And in 1968, when Frank Oliver was released, a newspaper states that Blackstone died of a heart attack in 1950. Fred Smith's brother died in Pennsylvania a few months after Fred went to prison, and Sammy Smith, another brother of Fred Smith, was taken from a freight train in 1935 and questioned in the killing of a 7-year-old boy. I didn't find any articles saying that Sammy Smith was convicted in this crime, which I'm sure would have been huge news if that was the case. I'm thinking basically if you were associated with these guys, you ended up, if something happened, you were going to be blamed for it. And that also is true for some of the people involved in the vision that this guy had. So if you recall, the man that had the vision, he said that he went to talk to Otis Odin. So Otis Odin was a black bootlegger who sometimes Blackstone stayed at his place. And so he's the one who says that Blackstone came in at about 5:30 in the morning and he was all nervous as anything. And this is where the dude that has the vision gets the premonition that, oh, he's guilty. And then he goes to Blackstone and talks to him, and then he says Blackstone's shaking, so then he knows that he's the killer, and he goes to the police after that. So Otis Ogden actually ends up going to jail for 2 to 4 years for being a bootlegger. His wife also served some time, and it was said that their whiskey, which they called White Mule, inspired the Torch murders. So really, if they could draw any type of connection from you to Blackstone, Smith, or Oliver, you were going to end up having some type of legal trouble, which may have been the case also for Oliver. He just may have been associated with these two guys and ended up in prison because of it. There's also a lot of information about in 1950 when Frank Oliver asked for a new trial. He says that he's a victim of quick justice. He was beaten. He was told to confess so that he wouldn't be lynched. And this also, I think, lines up for the other two because the evidence just does not point to them being the killers. But that is all for the torch murders. I am going to maybe revisit this again when I go back to Michigan because I'll be able to do some research on the ground, maybe take some photos and things like that. But that is all for now. And I'll see you in the next one where we will be talking about a woman who was called the Witch of Delray. All right, I'll see you in the next one.